In fact, nothing in video games truly scares me anymore.
I sawed this boat in half!
I wish I had the slightest idea of what the hell I was doing.
Hello and welcome to this video and my channel. I am Common. Horror is quite an interesting topic. What scares a person is subjective, and what scares one person will not scare another. However, that subjectivity can be used as a means of defense of people from their own critics. And to some extent, everyone does this. However, when you start offering suggestions on how to make things fall to your preferences, whether it be movies, literature, or in this case, video games, then said opinions become more of a generalization, and it goes out the realm of personal preference and seeing how these suggestions can cover up what you perceive to be flaws.
Soma isn't really a horror game. It's not scary.
Today's subject is Joseph Anderson. We'll be contesting the video that he put out not too long ago, titled, "Why Horror Games Do Not Scare Me."
In fact, nothing in video games truly scares me anymore.
Is that not the beauty and ugliness of the internet, where you can make whatever claim about yourself and proclaim it to be true? You're not afraid of horror games? You've got +10 biceps? You're dating a supermodel? I'm a disembodied skull talking to you right now. Is it a bit redundant to bring this up? Possibly, but this isn't actually a point, but an opening preamble. What I will say, though, is this video isn't just about debunking what Joseph Anderson is saying through this video. If he truly doesn't fear anything in horror games, I'm not going to contest that. But rather, this is also to discuss his solutions on how to make horror games scary. And while I don't mind people putting their perspectives out there, and I can actually respect that to some degree, I disagree with some of his logical conclusions, suggestions that he has, and the logic that he puts forth throughout this entire video. But then again, I could probably guess that's why you clicked on this video in the first place.
You could explain this away by saying I was a wimp when I was a kid, and that I grew tolerant to spooky stuff as I got older. However, there's a problem with this answer. Horror movies still scare me. Sure, it has to be above a certain level of camp and actually try to scare instead of startle, but these movies certainly exist and can creep me out. Same for a few horror books.
I understand that this is anecdotal. This is a question that needs to be asked. Do you have examples? With a number of horror movies out there, and with you being vague about what actually does scare you, this opens up a lot of questions. The reason I bring this up is throughout the rest of the video, he doesn't explain what scares him in movies. That vagueness is an issue, since if he did express what scared him in movies, then the possibility of there being games out there that tailored to that specific fear would go against what narrative he's about to be putting out there. Heck, knowing how vast the video game world is, perhaps there are games that do fit the bill. But with the vagueness that Joseph here is giving here, this opens up the issue of being able to backpedal should someone suggest a game.
Yet games can't do it for me anymore. And after years of thinking about it, the reason why finally clicked into place when I was playing Silent Hill 1 and 2 for the first time recently.
So, a small little spoiler ahead, but I feel like I should point it out, is that Joseph Anderson's experiences with Silent Hill 2 was through a live stream. Now, while that may not seem like much, it's almost as if I'm drawing attention to this fact because it'll be relevant later in the video. Huh! Neat! Foreshadowing!
This should, in theory, strengthen any situation that involves fear. In fact, this is why it took me so long to realize why video games don't scare me, because it feels so intuitive. Fear should be one of, if not the most powerful emotion that video games can invoke. When you're watching a movie, it's a character that you are passively tethered to that is in danger. You can't change anything that happens, although you may become so involved that you start yelling at them not to split up, or to not go through some spooky door that obviously leads to something horrible, but you yourself are never in any peril. When you realize this, you may wonder, why do you feel scared at all? Well, an answer, but not the only answer, is empathy. Either you are invested in a character, or you are imagining what it would be like if you were in that same situation. If you were being hunted by some unstoppable supernatural force, surrounded by zombies, stalked by nightmares. Terrifying. If you were to jump into the situation in place of the character, you can imagine how vulnerable you would be. So again, doesn't it feel so intuitive that in a video game, everything should be heightened since you are that character? You are in control. You are in the dangerous situation instead of the characters on their own.
Except you're not. First off, let's point out the fact that you're generalizing all horror games in this regard, ignoring the fact that if we go to more story-based gaming, this effectively can follow the same rules as a movie. Yes, you can influence the characters during gameplay, but during narrative-driven games, the level of freedom is limited in most games, unless we're talking open world, because if you were to say the main character of Silent Hill 2, James, you're still being controlled by his whims. You don't get to suddenly look at the letter of his dead wife, decide to get in your car and drive away from Silent Hill.
Screw this!
Story-based games don't offer total freedom to your character, because if they did in Resident Evil 7, would you ask the police officer for his gun?
Howie...
You gotta give me your gun.
Whoa. God, who goes up to a cop and asks them for their gun? That is like the #1 suspicious thing that you could possibly do.
But, more importantly, to address your empathy for the movie characters, why does that not apply to video game characters, especially characters that do have stories and personalities and characterization? Again, I am jumping the gun a little bit, but just because they're interactive, that doesn't mean you can't empathize with the character's plight in a narrative-driven game. That's not even considering side characters. But that's for a future point. There's also the fact throughout this video, Joseph is only focusing mostly on the fear of death, and that severely limits empathy since fear and empathy can expand to more than just the fear of death.
Turns out, no, not at all, at least not for me. Video game protagonists aren't human. You cannot fully commit to imagining what it would be like if you were to take their place because you are already in the place along with them.
And this is where Joseph starts to bleed outside his opinion and starts to be a bit more generalizing. The fact that he says, you cannot. Even though he stated in his last sentence before that, at least to me, this comes off as a bit contradictory. Could just be that his scripting is off-putting, but here's why it's off-putting. That differs from movies how? Like I said before, I know that interactive aspect is a key factor that he brings up.
God, who goes up to a cop and asks them for their gun?
But the problem is with this is that the fact that you're a disembodied invisible camera recording all the key moments in a horror movie pretty much goes with this aspect. We're along with the ride with the characters, and at some points even seeing it first-person perspective if your own examples in this very video are to be believed. And this goes back to me talking about how video game characters are on a rail. There are times when you'll want to go against what the story of a character or their own motivations or what they want to do in a game, but you can't. By this logic, Joseph Anderson's complaint should apply to horror movies, but it doesn't. Why? Well...
in addition to the superpowers every video game protagonist has. Typically, a main character in a video game can't die. Sure, they can get ripped apart, impaled through the chest, blown up, all sorts of things, but they always come back.
And the same could be said of horror movie heroes. Typically, the protagonists of horror movies do tend to be survivors. Not all the time, mind you, but there are a good chunk of that happening. There is a good chunk of that. It depends on the type of movie, much like it depends on the type of game. The fact that Joseph is painting such a large brushstroke here doesn't help. I mean, I'm not going to disagree that video game characters do respond in games can be off-putting, but Joseph here will neglect throughout the video about video game characters getting killed off in narratives.
Sometimes it's contextualized within the game's world, sometimes it's a simple reload screen and you're good as new. Better actually, since you've learned something to avoid that same death next time. See, it's because of the interactive nature that this doesn't work. When a character is in danger in a movie or a book, there's already a set ending for them.
Yep, apparently he doesn't find horror games scary because of meta. There is a set ending for video game characters. In fact, there are multiple endings in some games, and in fact, if we consider sidecasts, which you're implying here, they could easily be set for characters in games who aren't the main protagonist, and don't have the supposed immortality.
They very well could die in the scene that you're watching, or face lasting repercussions for mistakes. There's tension because every injury and every death is canon, whereas a death in a game is a release in tension instead of cranking the pressure even higher.
And this is where it becomes especially unfair, since Joseph Anderson is referring to every death in horror movies, but only equates that to the main character in video games. There are plenty of games that hold that exact same thing. Games off the top of my head like Corpse Party, Clock Tower, Misao are games that hold elements of that to them. And there are plenty more games that have that too. There are canon deaths or characters that you do get attached to that aren't the main character. Why do they not equate to anything in the video game?
You hit a fail state and restart. Suddenly that monster that killed you isn't nearly as threatening anymore since you've just experienced the reincarnation superpower of your character that you always knew was there but may have blissfully ignored until now. Imagine this happening in a movie. Death ruins horror games.
Another declarative statement of Rush over the entire genre, I see.
Now, it could be that many can still separate themselves from video game protagonists and imagine themselves with all of their real human weaknesses in their place and be spooked. I will never say that is an invalid reaction to horror games. Soma isn't really a horror game. It's not scary. However, doesn't it also mean that the game has failed to fully connect you with the character you're controlling?
Not necessarily. It's the same as watching horror movies, especially considering that horror games have that stories that still allow you to empathize with the characters in the story. It depends on how much you're willing to actually open yourself up to the character and invest yourself into said story. Of course, with what you say later... Although, a good point that my friend Wambu pointed out to me, thanks for looking over the script, buddy, is that this also feels like Joseph is putting a reversal on the logic that he made about movies. Yes, you cannot control the characters in movies, but wouldn't the hypotheticals still involve having empathy for the controlled character? It just seems a bit weird that empathy in this circumstance is equated to a failed connection between the character and the player.
Think of it this way, there is an Olympus Mons-sized difference between holy shit, that character is going to die, and holy shit, I'm going to die.
Again, not really, especially considering games have more characters than just the main character.
And this is all something a horror game has to deal with before deciding whether or not you can fight the spooky enemies, and whether that combat will be purposefully awkward to try and raise the tension, or something closer to an action game and an enjoyable part that isn't meant to be scary. This is where I conclude that most horror games aren't truly scary, but are instead horror-themed.
Gotta love that weasel word, yet he hasn't provided a single example outside his visuals, which goes for about 3 to 4 games, maybe 5 if you count Undertale as a horror game. Why'd I go southern there?
Not horrific on their own, they can have disturbing imagery, oppressive atmospheres, but this is done in the same way that many other genres theme their games. Action combat and or puzzle solving in a fantasy setting, sci-fi setting, historical setting, a spooky setting. This is by no means a bad thing, themes can be fantastic. To go back to Silent Hill 1 and 2, I was able to appreciate the atmosphere in both games immensely. Surprisingly so for the first game, where the dated visuals sometimes added to the experience all these years later. But I was never scared, just like no modern horror game has scared me either.
My name is Harry Mason. I'm in town on vacation.
Right, so for this point, I think it's time we tried out Joseph Anderson's Soma review in his live streams. Why? Well, here's the thing. From what I've seen on Reddit and what I've seen in his videos, Joseph Anderson tends to focus on a more completionist mindset when it comes to game. And because of that mindset, I believe that you'll get parts like this.
These turn the monsters into roaming inconveniences rather than scares, because they're not a threat, they're not interesting, they're getting in the way of the good stuff instead. 2 examples are the blind monster about halfway through the game that is in a dark room with a lot of stuff on the floor. The challenge here is to not trip over any of it so you don't make a noise. That's it. Really slow and boring.
In case you didn't notice, this is just him telling his audience what you have to do in this section and then labeling it to be slow and boring. Also, if this monster wasn't a threat, then you would have no problem bearing through all the stuff on the floor. This is conflicting information and makes me wonder if you actually pay attention to what you're writing. It also calls into question if you're even willing to involve yourself into the game. You claim that you're the character you're playing in the games, but these comments here more or less signal that you're acting as a third-party viewer.
The other times, your screen starts to fizzle in warning when you're in danger. This warning that something was nearby became a trigger for me to be annoyed rather than frightened. It was an announcement that one part of the game was over, and that it was now monster time.
Except this is not true. The tearing can be turned off, and even if you don't have it off, the tearing can occur when there are no enemies around. And the fact that Joseph Anderson here shows the Patchwork Man, an Easter egg enemy who was actually in the game to begin with but was cut in the final version, this poses no actual legitimate threat to the player, and it contradicts what he's saying. This to me tells me that he's either willing to lie to his audience, has terrible editing skills, or has terrible observation skills. I'm more or less willing to slide onto the poor observation skills. Why, you may ask? Well, for that we need to go back to the past.
So this is the tutorial after the tutorial.
Do not let him out of your sight. You must catch him.
Okay, will it just make us go up here? No? Okay, so we have to go, where are we going? Oh, can we just carve through it? Oh, okay. Sorry, I was thinking that Raiden was a normal person, my bad. Alright, so that's another one. So these are just regular enemies. Didn't we cut the other one? Is this the same one? Didn't we cut it in half? Or was it just, or was that just the arm? I thought we cut it in half.
I mean, it's not like the game outright says...
It still works.
and you can see that you only cut its arm off. Now you may be thinking that I'm cherry picking here, and I will give you that as I am specifically going to these clips right here to prove a point. During streams, and during some of his gameplay, Joseph Anderson can't pay attention to crucial details, and by his own admission, the first time he played Silent Hill 2 was via live streams. Hey, I actually got that foreshadowing coming back. In fact, let's talk about that Silent Hill 2 thing, shall we?
I'm 30 seconds into explaining what I don't like about it, okay, let's look at it at James for a solid example. There was, for a long time there, James was not sure if Mary was actually dead when he's the one that killed her. The reason why I don't like it that no one acts like a person is that because they don't act like people, nothing makes sense, and there can be no stakes, and there can be no chain of events that actually matters outside of, oh, that's cool. Because the way that they talk to each other and the way that James goes through it, it seems like it's building to some sort of mystery, and there's some sort of, okay, well, what's going on here? You know, what did he do? And it's just like, oh, well, he just forgot about something, or he doesn't really, he's not remembering well because the town is making him stupid. The town is making him stupid. I love this game and have looked at stuff on it online for years. Don't have answers to these questions. It makes me skeptical. Pyramid Head finally dies because he finally accepts what he's done. This isn't hard to figure out, dude. Pyramid Head died because I hit him with a sword, bro. Like, if that's actually what it is, it wouldn't be a fight.
I was weak. That's why I needed you. Needed someone to punish me for my sins. But that's all over now. I know the truth. Now it's time to end this.
So, if this is what sparked you to come to the realization that horror games aren't scary, as he stated in an earlier point in the video,
The reason why finally clicked into place when I was playing Silent Hill 1 and 2 for the first time recently.
this may be another factor. This may be due to the fact that Joseph Anderson isn't really paying attention to what the games are actually telling him. What's more ironic is that he's not apparently holding his standard to horror movies, all because of the fact of interactive elements in the games. I suppose ignoring story elements is one way to show that you're in control of the character. But hey, that's just a theory. A shame theory! God, someone let me on fire for making that joke. In any case, now that I've given you this little insight, it's a little more reasonable why Joseph Anderson wouldn't be scared of things in Silent Hill 2. Because he wasn't paying attention to what is scary. It isn't his focus. Now, to be completely fair, Joseph did try to get more information about the games on Twitter and get some more insight onto them. However, that's a moot point. Why, you may ask? Because there's nothing to do with this. His failing to understand the story and claiming it to be shallow. Anything can be shallow when you fail to pay attention to the finer details, and basing your initial thoughts on playthroughs that you have your attention divided. After all, you're interacting with your audience, you're trying to be entertaining.
I'm 30 seconds into explaining what I don't like about it,
Who knows what may slip through the cracks.
The game that has scared me the most recently isn't a horror game at all. Although it does have some unsettling elements to it, they aren't a core part of the experience. I'm going to show it on the screen now, and I'd like for you to give me a second to explain before you shut off the video, because...
Fine, we'll go back.
Okay, still here, I'll speak quickly. Don't Starve has some elements of psychological horror, but they're kept light. You have to manage your hunger and sanity. If your sanity goes too low, you'll begin to hallucinate. Monsters will appear and fight you. Your sanity will also drop along with your health if you are caught in total darkness at night. None of this would be particularly effective, except that Don't Starve has permadeath. You can construct extra lives for yourself, but they weaken your character by lowering their maximum health, and you need to commit resources to building a new one after each death. These are substantial enough hurdles that every life is precious. So when you make a mistake and realize as night begins to fall that you are low on food, health, don't have the materials on hand to make a light source, and have only seconds to solve these problems, you may feel, oh no, I'm doomed. I'm dead, as you scramble for a way out. Death has meaning, unlike almost every horror game out there that I've played.
By that logic, Minecraft hard mode must be a nightmare to you then. So essentially the fear of loss and how you have to start over again. In some sense, I do agree, but there are a few problems with this. Death doesn't have meaning with every horror game I've played. It really goes to show that you don't play a lot of horror games or have limited knowledge about horror games, since there are games that actually play to this sort of thing. One that comes to mind is Monstrum, where not only the enemies are randomized, the area is randomized, but you're also forced to start from scratch every time you die. However, and I know you point out the tedious nature of starting over again later, but something like this wouldn't work in narrative games. The whole objective of a game like Don't Starve is based on how long you can survive in the environment, and there isn't a focus on things like narrative or plot points or characters. Permadeath and story-based games wouldn't work because it would become more tedious. You'd have to sit through the story again, you'd have to deal with dialogue choices, and you'd also know exactly what to do again, and that can be viewed as boring. Things tend to not be scary a second time. In fact, Joseph here implies that. So this could apply to dealing with the entirety of a whole game's narrative. Games like Silent Hill 2 have more of a point to them than just dying in the game. Fear in games comes from more than just the fear of death, especially in the narrative of horror games. And unfortunately, by focusing on only gameplay and not the narrative, it's really disingenuous, especially since the narrative is all you have to go on with horror movies. But Joseph's willing to ignore that in video games because of one aspect, and I think that's really unfair.
Does this mean that I want every horror game to have permadeath? Well, yes.
Get used to disappointment.
In a way, but it's not that easy. Like most problems that encapsulate entire genres, this is complex.
Well, I don't agree with this opinion. There's actually a way to get around this. Just make permadeath optional. Like have permadeath be an option in the screen. There. Simple.
It's why I've always tried to make that clear when I've criticized horror games in the past for not being scary, Soma in particular. It's not a specific failing, it's genre-wide if you can reload after dying.
Focusing on the death of the character and nothing else, and that's the problem. Especially considering that you claim Soma not to even be a horror game and not scary based on your own false information. Play the clip!
The other times, your screen starts to fizzle in warning when you're in danger. This warning that something was nearby became a trigger for me to be annoyed rather than frightened. It was an announcement that one part of the game was over, and that it was now monster time.
You didn't understand the stylistic choice of the game and assumed it, but your footage proved you wrong, and it wasn't the only time you did that. I could attribute this to malice.
James repressed the memories of killing Mary to the point where he believes Mary died when she got the disease? What? How do you figure that out?
But then again, I'm under the mindset of don't attribute malice to what can be explained by ignorance.
I also fully expect that many people will disagree with me, but just consider how much more powerful a visually terrifying enemy in a horror game would be if it also had the ability to inflict tangible consequences upon death. How much more frightened would you be if it caused you to truly consider retreat as the best option, making you say, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, as you run, because if you do die, you can't simply respawn with nothing lost.
Again, that depends on the game and depends on where the respawn is, as well as how far the respawn takes you, as well as how many items you may or may not have had at said respawn. That is really dependent on whether or not the respawn is instant too, like you're brought right back before you were killed or you're brought back to your last save. There are a lot more factors to this and shouldn't be just generalized like that.
And also consider the opposite, that sometimes if a fight goes so poorly for you that you wasted too many healing items and ammo, dying becomes an attractive option since you can restart and have a better second take.
Again though, that's not going to apply to every situation in the game. What if your previous save file you had short supplies and you barely restocked when you had this encounter? Do you have specific examples to pertain to this? Or are you using your bad on purpose gameplay of Dead Space to have your audience expect to take your word?
You may even get angry at the monster when it takes too long to kill you so you can see the reload screen. How scary is that? Of course, you can't slap permadeath onto a game, step back, and then consider it a job well done as you pat yourself on the back. The only reason it works in Don't Starve is because each playthrough is different. Each attempt is a challenge to live as long as possible, and you learn and then try again with each retry. Even here, however, having to start over can carry too harsh of a punishment when you've been playing for long enough and can cause you to give up.
Well, thanks for undermining your own damn point.
Transplanting this system onto a linear story game wouldn't work. Other changes would have to be made too. A drastic transformation into a roguelike is an obvious one. Randomized areas, monsters, traps, and even pieces of a story would work well in a horror game. Making you constantly uncomfortable and never going through the motions brings with it a lot of what horror needs to be successful in my opinion.
You wanna know what the kicker is though? There are games like this. Heck, Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion is exactly like this. When I can point to examples like this, it really shows that Joseph Anderson doesn't have a good grasp of the variety of horror games. Topped it up with how he's not able to follow the narrative of games that made him come to this realization for this whole video spells off a double standard with movies. Movies have a narrative to them, same with books, and that's really unfair to games whose horror elements stem from their narratives and not from the gameplay. But again, to be fair, it's good that he wants to have a compromise. However, going roguelike with horror games wouldn't exactly do any favors for games like Silent Hill 2, where a lot of the individual set pieces and level layouts in and of themselves have significance on the story and the character. Also, having these permadeath stakes could still very easily have tedium if the game wants to be more focused on its narrative. I've already explained why, so I won't repeat myself again. But before we continue, I think it's best to address the permadeath thing right here a little bit more. I will agree that permadeath can make a player care for their life in the game more, especially in the horror genre. However, it's not without its own cost. This comes with the risk of making the player hold back on feelings of exploration and discovery. This is due to the fact that dying would become too much of a pushback for the risk to discover more outlandish and out-of-the-way thing. Secondly, this changes what the player is scared of in horror games. Something that Joseph Anderson here fails to mention. Instead of being scared of and using amnesia as an example, the guardians, the shadow, the torture events, or what have you, the focus will be pulled from the atmosphere to just the fear of having to start over. I fully agree that this is subjective, but remember that Joseph Anderson here is complaining about respawning immediately stems from tedium and dying, and restarting from the beginning of each game really be scary at the third, fourth, or fifth time? Permadeath turns a horror game into survival, stay-away games, instead of actually allowing the player to immerse themselves in the core of horror itself, scaring players when they're exploring the maps and investigating the narrative. At best, if this were to become a mechanic in horror games, it should be an option for the players to choose. Again, choosing the option should be up to the player, and if Joseph Anderson advocated for horror games to have this option, then I'd be for it. Too bad I never brings it up. In addition, this is also dependent on the length of the game as well. Shorter games, yes, this would work better. We do have games like Monstrum or Amnesia Justine that have permadeath and are short enough to make it not be as tedious. I'm not going to say that there's not an objective level of tedium, but game designers need to be able to consider these sorts of things whenever they consider making games.
Throw in some subtle ways of messing with you, sort of like what Eternal Darkness did on the GameCube, and you may have the right recipe for a horrific game with permadeath stakes that won't be frustrating.
You don't know yet!
You make decisions that cause changes in the story, and sometimes these can result in death. Permanently. These dumb teenagers do not come back afterwards. Please do not think I am parading Until Dawn around as a wildly successful horror game because it has huge problems, but it's undeniable that knowing characters can die adds a great amount of tension whenever they're in danger, especially the first time when all you know is that decisions matter and you're not aware of the specific places the character can meet their end. There's a way Until Dawn can reinforce the idea that death can become meaningless when you look up after you're done and find out that the tension in many scenes was faked because characters can't die there. Something similar could be done in other games without resorting to permadeath leading to a game over. Imagine a Yoshi's Island style relay of characters along for the spooky ride, and if you die, then that's one dead from the roster and you move on to the next one with the other one gone forever.
You mean like Fire Emblem? But if we want to just stick with horror games, that exists as well. Games like Corpse Party have a similar mechanic to that end, and where universes in the game can get characters permanently killed, and not just the ones that are canon to die.
Or in a game like Inside or Little Nightmares, death could result in being moved to a different line of progression for a worse ending, and then an even worse one after that if you die again.
You do realize that locking out of certain endings at random points can be used against you on the emphasis of tedium, right? If you get locked out of an ending you poured hours into a game, then you're stuck with only the option of starting over again, meaning you'd have to do everything over again. This wouldn't work with narrative games, since you'd be forced to relive the story again and again, having to go through every enemy, obstacle, puzzle, and what have you again. Really, that level of tedium would be a lot worse. But hey, I'm going off by the logic that you're giving in this video, Joseph, because going back to Silent Hill 2, this would be awful because the story is very personal. You couldn't kill off James and continue the game with a different character and have it make sense, since he's tied so closely into the themes and plot of the game. In addition, let's try flipping some logic around, shall we? Remember when Joseph brought up the motivation to die on purpose? Couldn't this also be a motivation to die on purpose? After all, this would hypothetically be a different experience with a game triggered by death.
The idea here is that you can still continue and finish the game if you get grabbed by the ghoulies, but that you really don't want to. The alternative is that horror games require more suspension of disbelief on the player's part, and that you should meet them more than halfway in order to be scared. I reject this idea because I don't have to do that in order to appreciate scary movies, and that I never have to adopt this mindset in order to be impressed by other genres and games. If something in a game is visually stunning or a boss fight hits the right level of challenge and engagement, the game is responsible for getting me there without me having to pretend to be along for the ride.
So wait, this is a little confusing. Joseph, you don't have to suspend your disbelief to appreciate scary movies? What about movies that feature the supernatural? You just assume that ghosts are real and therefore you can be scared by them? Does that mean all concept in horror movies presented are things you don't need to suspend your disbelief to some extent? I find that difficult to believe, because if that were the case, you wouldn't be able to say that about horror movies. You would know that it's fake. Throw in the fact you're completely ignoring the narrative of video games and solely focusing on the gameplay mechanics to chastise all horror games when you've barely given any actual examples other than using out-of-context footage throughout most of this video, and that you've openly shown you don't understand the aspects of horror games, like in the case of Silent Hill 2.
Hammerhead died because I hit him with a sword, bro. Like, if that's actually what it is, it wouldn't be a fight.
I was weak. That's why I needed you. Needed someone to punish me for my sins. But that's all over now. I know the truth. Now it's time to end this.
Or Soma.
Soma isn't really a horror game. It's not scary.
This comes off as more ignorant and biased. As for engagement, what about the story? I know I'm repeating myself, but when you're only focusing on the visuals and gameplay, you're kind of being disingenuous to the stories in horror game. At best, the only thing you've said is that you can place the story in randomized game. While you're not wrong, please tell me how that would be effective in games like Silent Hill 2 that's driven by its narrative.
I don't want horror games to give me the opportunity to roleplay as someone who's scared. I want to have no choice but to be scared. Because that's what terror really is. It comes at you with surprising potency, hits you with a jolt, and leaves you both hot and cold at the same time.
You know, for someone proclaiming this to be his opinion, you're really using a lot of language that comes off as if you're stating a fact. There are games out there that don't put any sort of fear into the player and treat the player as though they are the character themselves. Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion does that itself.
Just like the jump scare that's about to appear at the end of the sentence. Just kidding, I wouldn't do that to you.
Again, this is not coming off as an opinion, but you trying to pass it off as a statement of fact.
Death isn't the only way to inflict punishment for being caught by a monster. In fact, as always, my proposed ideas aren't meant to be actual things that could be done, but rather demonstrations of what a game could look like on a surface level. In this case, it's to make monsters genuinely terrifying while you are in control of the game.
By adding consequences? I mean, there are other methods. How about Nemesis from Resident Evil? You know, the big boss character who you couldn't kill throughout the game except at the end, could chase you into different areas and could use the rocket launcher, a weapon that the player character could use in previous Resident Evil titles. Or how about Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica, where Nemesis could one-shot you if you failed to complete a level before a time limit runs out. There are more effective ways to add this sort of thing in games other than just having permadeath.
A fail state may force you to make a difficult choice in the game's story, or ask you to choose which supporting character will receive punishment for your mistake. The balance here is to never make this punishment result in a game that is worse to play after that point.
Then why the hell would you suggest locking a game into a single set ending after dying once, and locking off the better endings?
Just like a setback caused by death should never become a tedious trip through repeated content no matter what the game is.
Why should permadeath be in story-driven games? I know he said that other changes would have to be made in a game, but by doing that you're advocating for every horror game to play in a similar manner, integrating horror games into a set formula just so they can scare you specifically.
The other important thing is to make sure mistakes are always the fault of the player if the punishment is going to be so severe, but that isn't an issue unique to the horror genre. What is unique is that you're meant to feel frightened for yourself and for the character starring in the game you're playing. A character that is an immortal force of nature that can never be killed, only stricken with inconvenience.
But apparently not the side characters. Well, screw you, Walking Dead. And that's another thing you're not taking into consideration, the fact that a lot of horror movies have side characters, and the same goes for video games. Why is there no fear for your choices or actions in killing side characters in video games? That you can't empathize with them? Then again, since you're ignoring that narratives in games can be a way to scare you, I suppose ignoring characterization also gets ignored.
Ironically, just like the monstrous supernatural villains that slash their way through their victims throughout the course of their movies. It's a strange conflict when you realize it. It's like Superman being afraid of a spider, or Jason being afraid of some boobs.
Not really, and that is kind of a bit of a telling about you. You just don't understand fear. Fears can be logical and illogical. You're only focusing on logical fear here. Things like the fear of death, injury are logical since it stems from our natural response of not wanting to get hurt. But then there are things such as the fear of the dark, the fear of clowns, or the fear of falling asleep. Things that, while have some cement and logic, can also ultimately be illogical. Superman having a fear of spiders? It wouldn't be a disconnect. Nor would Jason being afraid of boobs. I mean, if I'm assuming that you're referring to Jason Voorhees here, but for someone who's trying to get knowledge about horror, Jason does have an irrational fear. A fear of water. Yeah, we learned that in Freddy vs. Jason.
So next time you're playing a horror game, ask yourself, are you really as scared as you could be? Or are you appreciating the fiendishly realized theme of the game instead of its actual scares?
Well, here's a question for you. Are you actually paying attention to the games?
I'm 30 seconds into explaining what I don't like about it, okay, let's look at it, James, for a solid example. There was, for a long time there, James was not sure if Mary was actually dead when he's the one that killed her. The reason why I don't like it and no one acts like a person is that because they don't act like people, nothing makes sense, and there can be no stakes, and there can be no chain of events that actually matters outside of, oh, that's cool. And remember, no matter how weak a horror protagonist may be compared to other genres, there's no way to dismiss their immortality. You are a person safely separated from the horrific world, remotely controlling an unstoppable god, wasting the potential video games have to fully realize what we've all wondered while watching horror movies.
So, how's that opinion where you assume to speak for more than just yourself?
What would I do if I was trapped in this situation? I eagerly await the game that pulls this off for the humans instead of the monster.
Too bad those games exist, you just haven't found them yet. You know, what can I say about this video? It's that Joseph Anderson kind of misses the point.
He's not remembering well because the town is making him stupid. The town is making him stupid.
And since he was off the mark in his live streams about Silent Hill 2 and how he didn't understand the game's story and wasn't paying attention to what was happening, I'm more or less willing to believe that the actual reason why he's not afraid of horror games is because he's not paying attention. The horror in games doesn't come from just the gameplay, it also comes from the characters, it comes from the story, and it comes from the themes. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of a video I did addressing a guy named Josh Sargent from Crack.com. I used to think that was a straw man, but now I can understand why some people would think that gamers don't truly care about the story, and in this video that Joseph Anderson put out completely ignores narrative of games and how it impacts fear, the same way that movies do. Gameplay in games should take precedent. That much I can agree on. However, if there is a story, it shouldn't be bogged down by tedious gameplay. Games are a fantastic medium for telling stories and fun, but that's the thing, developers need to be able to consider what they want to focus on more. Do they want the story to be more prominent, or do they want the gameplay to be more prominent? Why not both? Well, you tell me an objectively great game that's got a perfect story and perfect gameplay. And on the off chance that Joseph Anderson does see this and responds, either through a comment or even a vague tweet, let me tackle a possible counter-argument. That throughout this, my examples are an exception and not the rule to what he's saying. Sorry, how dare I take you at your word? That's more on you for not knowing how the depth of the genre goes and how you're willing to paint these games like this. Your vagueness and generalization is not really helping the situation. What doesn't help is this video is that it's under the guise of an opinion piece. Gotta have that shield, right? I'm sorry, but when you say stuff like this in your videos,
Soma isn't really a horror game. It's not scary.
And claim things like that are an opinion, you don't know what an opinion is other than a helpful shield to deflect criticism that may come your way. Then again, maybe I'm just being a bit jaded here, but in any case, it's just my opinion. Yeah, ironic humor. That's a way to end this and not confuse anyone at all. I'm SkullCommon, and remember to examine your fandom.